Greetings. Welcome to Unit 2, Section 1, Part B1, Effects of the Industrial Revolution, 1800 to 1900. In this, we're going to explore how these changes we talked about at the end of our last set of notes, the increase of the factory system, the use of steam engines and other new technologies, well, we're going to learn what are the effects of these, specifically focusing on Great Britain, but a lot of these concepts we're going to talk about can be applied to, well, really anywhere in Western Europe that industrializes. It could be applied to the industrialized cities of the United States, to a lesser extent Canada. And a lot of these can also be applied to industrializing or modernizing parts of the world today. Examples would be New Delhi and Mumbai, or Bombay in India, and certain industrialized segments of China like Shanghai and Beijing. Our self-test questions: what role did technology play in the Industrial Revolution? Kind of a key concept here we've been exploring. What were the effects of urbanization, or people living in cities, and industrialization on the people of the industrial world? What new economic, social, philosophical, and political developments were a product of the Industrial Revolution? And is technological progress always positive? And I'd like to try and give at least 3 examples to support your answer of yes or no or maybe. So when we last left off, we talked about how the industrialization and the industrial ideas of the revolution quickly spread. They begin in Great Britain, right? That's a fact we hit a lot last set of notes because of the advantages and factors of production that Great Britain has. And then it spreads, so spread of ideas outward. These new technologies, these new techniques, all of these diffused or spread to most of Western Europe and as well United States of America, and they're slowly going to make their way through the world, specifically in the late 1700s and the mid to late 1800s. So this is why this is a major turning point. Though this begins localized really in Great Britain, its spread is going to fundamentally change all elements of the world. The way we work, the thought process behind how we work, where we work, everything is changing. Specifically, we're going to focus on the concept here of European history, but very easily this industrialization can be spread as an enduring issue to a lot of the parts of the world today. Powerful warships in the world is nothing more than scrap wood in the space of a couple decades. Other changes in transportation is the steam-powered locomotive or railroads. Please star that or highlight that. This is pretty much equally as important as the steamboat. I mean, I tend to give a little bit of extra weight to the steamboat because, you know, how much of the world is covered by oceans. But the railroad is incredibly impactful as well. It is a significant invention. It creates smaller distances. What used to take weeks to cross can be crossed in a matter of days. I mean, this is an example from U.S. history, but you have that transcontinental railroad. You take this journey from the east to the west coast of America that used to take 6 to 10 months in a covered wagon, and it can be accomplished in 7 to 8 days. So the vastness of Europe becomes travelable in a space of hours and days anywhere in Europe. Trains can also transport heavy industrial goods more easily. So that makes the production of larger things or more goods at high volume, which the factories are capable of doing, they can now be shipped in bulk. So this supports the industrialization of cities and the industrialization of goods. Goods, people, and information move faster. While most of Europe had developed a pretty advanced postal system by carriage and horse by the 1800s, trains can move even faster, can move more bulk of mail, and they connect major city points more regularly because they need, very strict schedules on the movement of these locomotives so they don't, crash on the train set. And so what you have is a continent-spanning information system, and it's really incredible the impact that has on Europe. Another effect of both the steamboat and the railroads is coal. Coal becomes this incredibly important resource in this industrial period. It's the oil of the old society. It powers everything from the factories to the trains to the boats. Without coal, you're nothing. And so what this does is place great importance and wealth and power in the countries that have access to coal, and other countries will fight for access to coal. We other see changes in Europe dealing with big business and the advent of capitalism. This pre-industrial mercantile system where trade's like aggressively protected and controlled by the government, that's going to die out, and it's going to give way to industrial capitalism. Capitalism is an economy governed by the natural forces of supply and demand. We talked about this, and we're going to talk about it again. This was the theory of Adam Smith in his pivotal text, The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776. And he says that there are natural laws that govern an economy. And that text is really going to be embraced by these industrial capitalists, these industrial businessmen. They're forming the first stock exchanges. They become a new class of individual who make their wealth not necessarily from land like the nobles of old, but they make their wealth from investment of their capital. So these industrial machines, these factories, all of this is expensive to create. So they have to raise capital. And this is the creation of these early stock markets. Businesses sold stock or part ownership in their companies in order to raise the capital to buy new machines, to build a new factory. And that then cause and effect leads to the creation of this new social class, this capitalist or investor or business class. Yeah, I know they have several different terms and the regions can use any one of these, but these people become kind of a new aristocracy. Some of them actually buy their way into the aristocracy. They buy huge tracts of land, which gives them title of nobility. And what we see, another effect of this, is increasingly an unequal distribution of wealth. That these people pass their wealth on to their children, who invest it in stocks even more, who become even wealthier. But if you don't have any money to invest in the stock market, which most of the poor and even the middle class do not, then you don't get wealthier. So the wealthier get wealthier and everyone else stays about the same. And many have drawn parallels to modern America, where something like 90% of all stocks are owned by the top 15% wealthiest people in America. Most people don't really own a lot of stock because you need a lot of money to buy it. Other changes to the social class system is the growth of the middle class. Industrialization increases what had already started in Europe, this growing middle class from the commercial revolution. Well, why does it grow? Well, there are new jobs and positions, but it also splits, creating an upper middle class and a lower middle class known as la petite bourgeoisie. Remember, bourgeoisie is kind of our wealthier people. We talked about that when we did the guiding reading on the Ancien regime in France. And so this is what this split looks like. You have your upper middle class. They are bankers and investors, low-level investors. They're doctors, lawyers, and the smaller factory and business owners. And they have a decent amount of money, but they're not breaking the bank per se. They might be able to claw their way within a generation or two into the actual upper class as well with smart investments. And then you have this massive lower middle class, a much larger group. They're the ones with engineering jobs, they're accountants, they're factory and business managers, civil servants, clerks, and the smaller artisans, merchants, and business owners. And this is the class that sees arguably the most growth, because a lot of these jobs specifically come about because of the Industrial Revolution. Engineers, you need to keep machines running and to design new ones. Accountants, because of all the increased business of the factories, you need an army of accountants keeping track of what's bought, what's sold in these huge books called ledgers. You need managers, right? Floor managers to actually manage the factories. As governments expand under the state of nationalism, you need more civil servants to keep track of the running of government. And you need clerks. Clerks are basically people that can read and write, and they manage huge parts of the businesses. And the role of clerk has almost been folded into like everything else that many people in white collar professions do. And these are, in fact, like your white collar professionals. You also have huge fundamental changes in the working class. And I'd like you to star this, please. This idea that more and more they become unskilled laborers. And the old concept of being a skilled laborer is you have a skill, you're in a guild, you know something, you can do stuff that other people cannot do without years of training. But the factory system destroys a lot of that. These machines are so easy to operate, dangerous, yes, but easy to operate that you can be taught your job in an hour or less. You need very little training. So these workers are unskilled. And when you're unskilled, you're easily replaced. And that is a scary thing to be, because if you are arguing with your boss or asking for a raise or you get injured, they don't even care. They just fire you, you're out, and they find someone else who doesn't have any skills but can be taught your job in an hour, and you're gone. So this group arguably benefited very little from the Industrial Revolution. Like, they had jobs, which was good because they were frequently the farmers kicked off the land and the children of those farmers. But they didn't actually see a huge increase in their standard of living. And some have argued they saw a decrease in their standard of living. They had little job security, again, can be fired at the drop of a hat. They had, very harsh working conditions. All right, it was very dangerous, hot or cold, one or the other, usually work that they did. They then went home to live in very poor living conditions, crowded in these tenements, in these smoke-filled segments of the city, and they had very little opportunity for advancement. While they're working on these factory machines, they're not picking up any new skills, they're not reading, they're not gaining a college education. They're gonna work in that factory until they get fired or they die. And that's about it. And this is the areas in which they would live. There are also social changes that deal with gender during the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution fundamentally changed both gender roles and relations and the lives of children. In the poorer working families of these unskilled laborers, both women and children in industrial Europe worked long, dangerous jobs to provide enough money to live. This wasn't really them adding to the money of the family in a way that we're going to dig ourselves out of this terrible life. They literally needed everyone in the family to work just to have enough to survive. Both the children, and these are coal workers, and the women were paid less than men for the same job. Enduring issue-wise, many studies have shown that today, women, even in the same job or job line, are paid less than men. So that's an easy enduring issue to show continuity and change, that while they might be paid more and more women are in the workforce today, not just of this poor class, but women of all social walks of life, they are still on average paid less than men with the same position. In the middle classes and the upper classes, women stayed home. I mean, that was the sign of being truly middle class, is that your wife did not work. They took care of the children, and if you were wealthy enough, honestly, you had servants that took care of the children. You had a nanny, because labor was cheap. So you just hired a poor woman to take care of your kids. And that was a better job than, working in a factory all the time. So many women tried to get that job. And your middle class children, they went to school. Poor children, they worked in the mines, they worked in the textile mills. Your middle class children went to school. They had a pretty good life. They had these things called toys that they got to play with. Not like, hey, Johnny, here's a lump of coal to play with. Like, they got toys. They had a pretty good life. And this industrialization and urbanization, then, you're seeing a breakdown of the traditional roles and cultural values, specifically with young women in the working class. For the first time ever, young women who are working are allowed to move out of their family's house. They don't have to live under their father's roof. And in fact, they can get jobs, rent apartments with other girls, have female roommates, and you're going to see them move more and more towards marrying people that they actually like. Arranged marriages, at least for the middle and the lower classes, start to fall apart in Europe. Still there in China, still there in India, still there in other parts of the world. But more and more, this idea of marrying someone you actually like comes a thing in Europe. Huge changes because of the industrialization in the process of urbanization. Please star and highlight this. The Industrial Revolution increased European urbanization. More and more people are going to move to and live in cities. So again, this is migration, this is population as the population changes. Why? This is where the jobs were. Really, this is what you have to know. People migrate to find jobs so they can feed their families and, not die and do all this fun stuff like living and feeding your children. So people are moving from these farming villages to the factory towns, to the cities to find work. Some of these are those farmers driven off the land because of enclosures, and then they just stay in the factories. And this is an incredibly old type of photo. This is called a daguerreotype. It's a precursor to actual photography. And you can see this urbanization. At the core of this area, you will have the actual factories with their long smokestacks belching out coal smoke. And then all around them are these tenement apartments where the workers live. And this is just an incredible moneymaker if you're the factory owner, because you own all of this land. You own the factory, and you also own the apartments the workers live in. So they come to your factory, they do work, you don't pay them very much, and then they have to pay you rent to live in the apartments, which you didn't spend a lot of money building because they're terrible apartments. So you're really making money off of your own workers. It's a pretty vicious cycle. Why are factories located in these urban areas? Well, it has to play around with geography and population. The earliest towns and cities were always near rivers, right? They needed that access to water to have clean drinking water and to wash away waste. Well, the earliest industrial machines and transport needed water, right? You have water wheels, so that's the earliest factories using water wheels. And then the steam engine also needs large volumes of water as well. And then where are you going to put all these industrialized goods? It's very expensive, heavy, and slow to move them overland by ox cart until the train's invented. So you're going to put them on a barge and float it down a river. Factories needed workers, cheap sources of labor. In cities, they have more and larger populations, so factories are going to be located near the cheap labor. People couldn't just hop on a bus and take a bus 40 minutes away or 30 minutes away to get to work. They literally needed to walk there. And because of this, you need a massive population very close. Industrial businesses needed infrastructure in order to grow. They needed docks, trains, city lights and electricity, regular mail and canals, sanitation lines to drain, various chemicals and sometimes poisons away. And cities were more likely to have this, right? Rural areas are less likely to have internet today. That's an easy way to show enduring issues that, to this day, cities still have more infrastructure than the countryside. The main difference today is not electricity. Most people have electricity in many countries, or at least in America, Western Europe, and large portions of China, but the internet might not exist, which is needed for business today. And as more businesses locate in cities, they kind of gain a bonus from being near each other. You can have all steps of production within quick transport. You have your coal, which is dumped into cities. You have your iron production, so you can buy stuff. You have steel production, railroad ties. All of this is located in one area, which means it's easier to get the resources you need to produce things in your factory. So all of these are the reasons why factories and businesses were located. And a lot of them early on are located near coal. Coal, again, is necessary for the steam engine. So what are the impacts? How is this urbanization significant to the people living in Great Britain, in towns like London and Manchester and Birmingham? And how is it significant to other industrialized cities in Europe like Paris, Lyon, or Lyon, Berlin, all those examples as well. Well, in a very short period of time, European cities literally doubled and then tripled and then quadrupled in size. However, as the populace is literally rushing into these cities to find jobs, or they're forced out of their farmland, and so they need to find jobs and a place to live, the cities were not really built to handle this. There's no city planning, there's no zoning. Like, no one can build a pesticide factory near my house. My area is zoned for light commercial and residential. So I don't have to worry about some terrible company, producing poisons near me, because they can't. We have laws and zoning codes against that. That did not exist back then. You had money, you wanted a factory, you built it wherever you wanted. And it was just throwing poison into the air, into the ground, into the water. There were no building codes. I can't just decide I want more power at my house and gut out my own electrical and put in a new service. You need a licensed electrician to do that. You need a building inspector to come and make sure your electricity won't set the house on fire and kill people. They had none of that stuff. There were no fire escapes. When one of these buildings lit on fire, just everyone pretty much died, unless the fire was far enough away from the entrance. These buildings only had one entrance and exit. So if something was blocking it or the fire was at the entrance, just everyone's dying. There frequently wasn't adequate housing. People are just jammed into tiny rooms living together. There was very little sanitation. People just dumped their garbage on the streets, and so you had layers of filth and excrement and nastiness just dumped onto the street. For the poor, there were no opportunities for education early on. There was no real law enforcement early on. You had sheriffs and constables, but the idea of a police department was completely alien to these early cities. And in fact, police departments are built out of the need. They're a reaction to this massive influx of people into the cities. And there was no pollution enforcement. They did not care. They're just dumping everything in the atmosphere. So again, obviously, all of these things have changed today. So an easy way to talk about continuity and change is that, people reacted to all this craziness and these bad conditions. Now we have city planning boards. Now we have building codes. Now we have generally adequate housing. Put a pin on that one. That one's controversial. Now we have sanitation. Now we have opportunities for education. Put a pin in that one. That one's controversial. We have proper law enforcement. Might be kind of controversial too. And pollution enforcement. Yeah, so we certainly have the concept of these on the books at least. This is going to be very significant, or significantly affect the population of these cities through their living conditions. Now, I want to be clear. This is not everyone's living conditions. If you're wealthy and upper middle class or even middle class, you're still living in decent parts of town around people who are like you. Like the middle class all live together, the wealthy all live together. As a general, France was kind of weird in that all social classes lived in the same parts. They just lived in different parts of an apartment building. But for the most part, the wealthy are living in nice areas and the poor are living in slums. I don't think that word is here, so we're going to write that in. Slums. This deals with inequality. This is an effect of industrialization. It deals with the scarcity of resources to provide everyone with equal living. You could talk about environment and their interactions, because what we're creating now is a new environment. This is the urban environment, the urban world as it is. And it's an effect of modernization. So a lot of enduring issues you see here. The working class, right, our unskilled laborers or our laborers, they are living in tenements. Tenements are shoddily built housing units and apartment complexes just stacked right on top of each other. These are incredibly crowded, often whole families living in a one-room kind of bedroom. Most tenements did not really have proper sanitation. They didn't have drainage. If they had a toilet, you had basically one toilet per floor, so you'd share a toilet with 6 or 7 other families. Taco night, it was a bit intense and back then. And the sanitation is a tricky term. It gets thrown around a lot on the Regents. So it's conditions relating to public health, especially clean drinking water and adequate sewage disposal. That's what sanitation is. You want sanitation, you want good sanitation, because that's going to reduce the likelihood of people getting sick. You had heaps of garbage out on the streets. You had pollutants, right? The smokestacks from the factories are just dumping right in there. The trains are belching coal smoke. Everything was covered with a thin layer of coal soot from it being burnt off. And these are primary source documents from this time period, kind of exploring how dark and gritty and grainy things were. You have a nice passage here that explores this. This is a novel, Mary Barton, by Elizabeth Gaskell. She was a more middle-class person that wrote about the plight of the poor. You went down one step, even from the foul area, into the cellar in which a family of human beings lived. It was very dark inside. The window panes were many of them broken and stuffed with rags. The smell was so fetid and rotten as almost to knock the 2 men down. They began to penetrate the thick darkness of the place and to see 3 or 4 little children rolling on the damp, nay wet brick floor, through which the stagnant, filthy moisture of the street oozed up. And you might say, well, Mr. Campbell, that's from a novel. Novels aren't real. Yeah, no, this is real. This is what life was like. She was writing about the conditions that people saw. And this is kind of a very famous cartoon called Gin Lane. And this is how the wealthy viewed these poor people in Great Britain. Is they're just gaggling in the street. They're just living, fighting. This woman's so inebriated, she drops her baby dead. This guy's just literally wasting away. You have a poor person fighting with a dog for a bone. Just utter chaos and anarchy. And that's how the wealthy view these poor laborers, that they lived like they were, savagely. Else, in order to get water, they have to travel to other districts. And yeah, that's a pain in the butt for them, but almost immediately, cholera cases drop significantly in this area. And he's able to prove that a sewage line had broken and was seeping into the water here, and the well that they dug from this pump was in fact only 3 feet away from a major sewer line. And the sewage, the human excrement, was seeping into the water, and in fact, it was germ. He also proves that boiling water can get rid of these germs. So all water should be boiled by the poor before they drink it. And all of this adds to this new growing idea of germ theory. So in attempting to fix the problems of this industrial society, he adds to knowledge, he leads to the spread of new ideas, he questions traditionalism, he leads to more modernization. Of course, today we fully embrace the concept of germ theory, that the foundation of modern science and modern disease treatment is based off of germ theory, at least when we know they are in fact germ-based diseases. So this is kind of a big deal. And this cartoon actually was on a Regents before 1866. You have this contaminated water pump, and they call Death's Dispensary open to the poor free of charge. So even back then in 1866, people kind of knew that it's the poor that are hit hardest by these diseases. What finally leads the British government to get up off their butt and make changes is the famous Great Stink of 1858. It's actually called the Great Stink. Human waste from sewers was just being dumped into the Thames River. So impact of geography, this is the main river in London that goes through London, the basis of London's trade. All the factories are located against it, and the factories are dumping waste too, but really it's the sewers just dumping human filth into this river, which then seeps into the water systems of the city. And this leads to intensely violent cholera outbreaks. And in 1858, in July and August, the hot summer sun is hitting this water, and it just smells of human crap and urine. And if you don't know this, Parliament, the building of Parliament, is actually located right next to the Thames River. As the smell from this horrific, nightmarish river reached Parliament, they literally, the parliamentarians, the leaders of the government, are like, we can't take this. They were soaking the curtains of the parliamentary building in lime and acid and chloride, like basically bleach, covering these in bleach, because they thought the smell of bleach would be better than the smell of, human feces. And they were dumping poisons into the river, which, the Thames River had no fish at this point. They'd been dumping sewage in it for 30, 40 years. There's nothing living in this river anymore. And the Prime Minister of Great Britain himself went into a meeting in Parliament and left within seconds with, covering his face with his handkerchief because the smell was that bad. So really across the board, there's a call then for new sanitation construction, new regulations, and improvements in health. And you got a couple great political cartoons here. You have this one called Children of the Thames. You have Lady Britannia, which is a political figure we're going to be seeing a lot, along with a guy named John Bull. She is horrified as Father Thames, which was this kind of cartoon figure of this poop river dude that was considered to be the soul or the spirit of the Thames River. And he's presenting the children of this horrific scenario of this public health crisis. Cholera right here, typhoid and typhus, these three diseases spread by poisoned water. And you have monster soup, and you have this woman looking through a microscope, and this is what they thought, all these little creatures looked like. So how are they going to do this? Well, in 1859, they appoint this engineer, Joseph Bazalgette. And they say, all right, we've got this problem. The river is horrifically polluted. Fix it. And so he designs 1,100 miles plus another 82 miles of internal main pipelines of new sewers, a series of industrial coal-powered pump stations and water treatment facilities to filter water out, and a series of embankments. They basically built these huge walls and a system of banks, artificial banks, for the Thames River to clean out all of this pollution and to provide room for all these new sewers. And this took, well over a decade to build all of this stuff. I mean, you can see here, this is a construction of the famous Bazalgette sewer, these huge lines coming in, these massive pipelines that are going to move huge amounts of waste. And really, after the opening of these systems, you have a massive drop in all of these diseases. It helped prove, in fact, that germ theory was real. There were still doctors and scientists who were like, germs? That sounds like voodoo to me. But when they build all these sewers and disease rates drop across London, it's like, yeah, clearly there's something in the water. And there was a famous incident in 1866. There was another massive cholera outbreak, killing nearly 6,000 people in less than a year. But all of the people, or almost all of the people who died of this, lived in this one shockingly poor neighborhood that hadn't yet been connected to the sewers, right? There is a long ongoing production. And again, that analysis, as doctors kind of figure out what's going on, why did these people die? I thought we're building the sewer. And they're like, well, it's not connected to the sewers yet. That's proving that cholera's waterborne. The design of this sewer system would be recreated by other major cities, including Paris, and basically it becomes the design system for modern city sewage works. That, every city has some level of sewage works, and the systems designed by Bazalgette influenced every single one after that. Within a short period, the average lifespan of people living in London increased by 20 years because he succeeded in saving so many lives. And these London works that he built, they've had a couple upgrades, But he basically still designed the system used in London today. And one of the most kind of famous and interesting concepts here is, he's an engineer. He does all sorts of calculations. He's a math whiz. And he tried to account for the population of London, then saw that it's increased by this much in 30 years. What will increase in another 30, and then another 30 after that, and then another 30 after that, based on population projections, and how much water do they drink, and how much waste does an average person produce in a day. And then he said, okay, that's how big we should make our pipes. And then he's like, you know what? My calculations could be off. Double it. And in doing so, that's why the London Pipeworks still exists today. For his actions in saving so many lives and designing this massive, massive, mile-long project, he gets knighted. So he becomes a knight, a member of the peerage in Great Britain. And there's a famous cartoon kind of heroically showing him as the sewer snake, which wasn't a bad thing. It's like he's the hero of the day. And this is a cool kind of illustration from the time period, so primary source document, of the Thames embankment that he engineered. So they're building out the banks of the river with all this massive stone edifice. You've got your subway line underground, so it's also engineering the beginning of the London subway system. He has his water lines, bringing clean water from reservoirs, and his sewage lines emptying the raw sewage out far, far away from London, cleaning out the rivers. So just an incredible individual whose work fixed a public health problem. Great example of cooperation that this engineer, along with hundreds, thousands of workers and other engineers, fixed this industrial problem. But there are other industrial problems, one of them being pollution. Air pollution from these factories, from these coal stacks specifically, led to all sorts of other diseases. One of the most famous ones was consumption. It was a cough and a infection and breakdown of the lungs, this nightmarish hacking wet cough that then would kill many people, especially the elderly, and children died of consumption. And it also led to the creation of new species and wiping out basically all fish that ever lived in the Thames River. And there's no regulations in this system, and no regulations really come about for air pollution until about the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. So for over 150 years, they don't really want to fix this problem. The Industrial Revolution also led to massive changes in Great Britain and Europe in working conditions. Working conditions for our industrial laborers were very, very bad. They worked incredibly long hours. 14 to 16 hours was normal for a shift, including shifts for children. They worked generally 6 days a week. They did get Sundays off, or at least half of it off to go to church, but they are working 6 days a week for that 14 to 16 hours. Most of these factories are very, very dirty. There was no benefit to cleaning them, so no one's going to hire someone to clean them unless they absolutely needed. They were very poorly lit, using either lamps, gas lamp, or dimly created electricity when electricity finally gets invented. They were either rarely heated, so super cold, or they were crazy hot because of all the steam machinery. Either of those conditions, as your fingers are getting numb from the cold or your body's just pouring sweat out from the extreme heat, none of those are very pleasant or healthy to work in. And the machinery itself was incredibly dangerous. There were no safety codes or safety regulations or emergency stop buttons for any of this stuff. That doesn't come about for decades and decades of people fighting to get safety regulations. So for the first nearly 100 years, there's no thought to real worker safety here. It's just like, yeah, Bill, don't get your fingers stuck in there. That's what happened to Little Johnny, and Little Johnny's now the original West Side gangster, and that's him for the rest of his life. Like, that kid's probably never going to find a job again. It's really brutal. Industrial accidents were incredibly common. There's a high risk of injury, and there was no disability, no insurance for these. You get hurt, you literally get kicked out of the factory on your butt, and that's it. Like, they're not even going to pay for you to get your hands stitched up because they don't care, and there's no law saying they have to. That, again, doesn't come about to like 100 years later. So let's take a wide fish kind of lens on this. What are some of the positive effects? Are there any positive effects of this industrial revolution? Well, one, it does create jobs. We do have to remember that you have a massive population increase in Europe because of the agricultural revolution. People are having more kids. The kids are surviving to adulthood. You need jobs for these people. Also, you need fewer farmers because of the threshing machine and the seed drill and improvements to farming. So they can't just become farmers. There's also only such a given amount of land, so you can't just magically make more land too easily. So the Industrial Revolution created jobs for these people. It provided them a means to survive. It did contribute to the wealth of industrializing nations. Great Britain becomes one of the wealthiest countries in the world. America industrializes and becomes one of the wealthiest countries in the world. Germany, France industrialize and become incredibly wealthy countries in the world. We're going to talk about it later, but Japan industrializes from about the 1860s on and becomes one of the wealthiest countries in the world. All these countries are still the top 15 wealthiest countries in the world. So obviously industrialization has an impact for the benefit of the nation itself, and by extension, some of the people in those nations. It encouraged technological progress. Technology didn't exactly move really fast for most of human history. We're like, oh, cool, we have a slightly different plow. That's pretty wizard. Yay, we have gunpowder. That was kind of a big deal, but the rate of progress wasn't very fast. And then the technological and industrial revolution happens, and all of a sudden there's a new invention every other week that's radically altering humanity. Every other year, every other decade, something dramatic changes. And we've never stopped that. Like cell phones, then become mobile phones, then become, basically everyone's everything. All of that is always changing and progressing, moving us to higher levels of technology. Whether that's good or bad, up to you, but always moving us upward on a slant of technological progress. The Industrial Revolution increased the production of goods and did increase the standard of living eventually. A good example of that is after the food riots of the 1800s, 1848, there are no more food riots in Western Europe. There's never been a famine, a true famine in the United States of America. There's been a Great Depression. Food was hard to come by. Some people might have died of malnutrition or starvation. But a famine where there's no food and people die off massively, after the Industrial Revolution, that never happens again in Western Europe, Great Britain, or America. We're going to talk about Russia. We're going to talk about Eastern Europe. It does happen for very specific reasons, which we'll talk about later this year. It did provide hope for the opportunity of a better life. It was possible, unlikely, but possible to claw your way into different social classes. Andrew Carnegie's an American industrialist who starts off, shoveling coal, ends up one of the richest men in the world. And there was this idea, especially in the middle class, that you could claw your way up into the higher levels of class structure. Eventually, housing, diets, and the standard of living increase because people have more than one set of clothing. They have more food to eat. They eventually get better housing than those terrible tenements. New occupations are created, which adds to the variety of people's lives and the variety of people's jobs that they can have. And cities, while, horrific and nightmarish in the beginning, eventually emerge as the centers of culture and industry. People like living in cities. I have several friends who moved to New York City. Why? They want the culture. They want the industry. They want the bebop hip hop down there. And so that can only happen if there are cities which are supported by industrial working classes. What about negative effects? Well, one, you have the breakdown of traditional roles and traditional culture, where before 90% of people were, small land, small plot farmers, now more and more people are going to be living in cities. More and more people are going to be living and working in factories. And that changes gender roles. It changes childhood. Childhood becomes a very different thing, especially towards the end of the Industrial Revolution, where schools are created and made mandatory for everyone in Western Europe and America. You really have the emergence of this idea of childhood per se. Negative impacts, the creation of low-skilled, low-paid, lower-class jobs, where these people have very few rights. These industrial laborers, they have a job, but it's tough, dangerous, dirty, underpaid, and then they go home and live in these terrible houses where they breathe in coal smoke. That's definitely a negative effect. It damages and alters the environment. Urbanization and industrialization led to disease and injury due to these unsafe living and working conditions, which are eventually fixed, but it takes almost 100 years to bother fixing many of these. And some we're still dealing with today, right? There was an outbreak in Cohoes in Flint, Michigan. That was an effect of this industrialization, specifically Cohoes with the plant that made, the factory that made those pans. And they were basically poisoning the ground and poisoning the water supply of Cohoes with this type of coating that was used in pan creation. That's only a couple of years ago that was found out. And you have a widening gulf or inequality between the rich and the middle class and the poor in Europe. The haves have more, the have-nots have little and less. Worldwide impact of the industrialization and the Industrial Revolution, you are going to see an incredible shift in power towards Western Europe. It increases competition between these countries. It increases their standard of living, and armed with industrialized weapons, steamboats, railroads, and technology, eventually like the machine gun and massive factory-produced rifles and weapons, they become powerful. European nations, Great Britain, France, and Germany become the world powers for all intents and purposes, in America as well. It widens the gap technologically between these industrialized and non-industrialized nations, which means the poverty in the less developed nations either increases or sees little progress towards making the nations more equitable. Non-industrial economies were still based on agriculture, cash crops, and smaller workshops, and it strengthened economic ties between parts of the world. Now, this is one of the biggest ones, and we're going to come to this so many times, you guys are going to be bored of me saying it. As they build factories, as these factories turn out actual tons, metric tons of goods, it increases the need for raw materials to fuel these factories. Not just coal, but if you're making lots of clothing, you need cotton cloth. If you're making lots of tools, you need lots of iron or other metals. If you're making electrical wire, you need copper. And so you need these raw materials. And then if you produce them, you need markets to sell them to. Like once everyone in Europe has a couple sets of clothes, well, you're only going to really sell the extra ones to the very, very wealthy and only if they're fancy. You need other people in other parts of the world. So all of this will lead to imperialism as Western European nations, stronger now with the balance of power tipped towards them, will build empires by conquering other parts of the world, specifically India, Asia, and Africa, to extend their interests, to obtain raw materials, and to obtain new markets. The Industrial Revolution also significantly impacted Europeans through a series of mass migrations from about the 1830s until the 1900s. Arguably, the biggest one of these was everywhere. Every country experienced this. The rural migration, as rural agricultural workers, i.e. farmers, right, are going to move to the cities and to these factory towns in order to find work. Then you have other huge shifts in migration, a lot of these dealing with kind of this rise of nationalism. Polish immigrants are going to flee Russian persecution, many of them coming to America, but many also settling in parts of what would become Germany. Germans themselves will flee to America after the failed revolution of 48. Russian Jews are going to flee persecution and pogroms, or violent acts by the Russian government. Many of them come to America, but many settle in Germany and France as well. And Italians leave Italy to find work, most of them leaving to America. Irish people, which we're going to go into much greater depth, they're going to flee the Great Famine, one of those few famines that do exist in Europe. But again, there are extenuating circumstances here. The Irish potato famine was caused by a blight, a disease that killed the potatoes, literally rotted them in the ground. The British government did literally nothing to help the Irish, and even tried to prevent donated food from reaching Ireland because they were terrible. And they lost 25% of their population. Many dying from death, and then many others fleeing to America and other countries to find jobs and food. And Ireland only recovered back to its pre-famine population in the last couple years. We have this map that shows our industrialized countries, also known as the core, and then you have your semi-industrialized areas, and then you have your non-industrialized areas. And you can see, obviously, there are large portions of the world in 1900 that still had a long way to go. There was, in fact, a second industrial revolution. This one I've only seen on the Regents a couple times, but I just like to go over it so you have it as ammunition, because it's a nice way to show how industrialization continues and how it changes. So it's going to give you more ammunition, because the early Industrial Revolution can be a little hard for us to wrap our head around, because life's just not like that in America or in other parts of the world too much. I mean, parts of China and India, yeah. But the second Industrial Revolution, you can see a lot more of. So it's occurring from 1917 to, 1914, 1920s, even 1930s. And it's the idea that, approaching 1870, the rate of technological progress of the Industrial Revolution had seemed to slow. And then all of a sudden, there was a rash, an outbreak of new technologies that all synergized. They all worked really, really well together, and they led to rapid development and rapidly new changes. So this will still increasingly and rapidly lead to new technologies, which is going to grow to meet demand. This is the birth of true modern manufacturing. While we have factories, our factories don't look too much like the factories of the early Industrial Revolution. When we think of a factory, it's really being born out of the second Industrial Revolution. It also leads to increasing globalization, which is the spread of ideas, spread of culture and technology and trade goods across the globe. So one of our first advances here, and again, remember, these are all going to synergize together, is machine tooling. They come up with harder and harder steels and metals, and they come up with tools that allowed for the easier shaping, cutting, and creation of metals or other hard substances. So they come up with these workshop tools that now, instead of just being able to work with wood and other stuff like that, they can create screws, they can create nuts, they can shape metal itself. That then leads to the creation of what's known as interchangeable parts. Once metal itself can be very easily shaped to exact specifications, we can basically engineer what things look like, and we can make sure every single piece that goes together is the same as every other piece in a different piece of equipment. So the first field that really took on interchangeable parts was gun production. You're using guns, they get dirty, they get broken, they get damaged. You don't want to throw out the whole gun, especially if you're an army or someone surviving out in the wilderness. So the ability to be able to buy interchangeable parts that this screw is the same as this screw, so I can just change out these screws and the firing pin and the gun still works. I don't have to buy a brand new gun. That really takes off. So now we can shape metal to our will. We create these interchangeable parts So they work interchangeably with each other and other pieces of technology. And that allows the creation of the assembly line. The idea that we're going to take these interchangeable parts, forge through machine tooling, and you're just going to have like bins of them, and you're going to use these parts to make whatever we're making. Because of the assembly line, goods, products become much cheaper because they're so much faster to make. Then it also becomes cheaper to make these interchangeable parts, these machine tooled parts. And it allows the development of new products, new consumer goods like refrigerators and radios can be mass produced. Another impact of the second industrial revolution was the Bessemer process. This made fast and cheap steel. And it can be hard to dig into these old facts and figures, but here's an example. All right, early on, before this process, steel was about $76 a ton. Now, this isn't modern day money, this is back then money. With the Bessemer process, that went down to $13 a ton. All right, and you multiply by 70 to get today's money, by the way. But that is the impact of this process. Machines, railroads, metal ships, larger buildings, skyscrapers, all of this could be produced faster and cheaper, and it increased locomotive construction. 1860, these are the main locomotive lines you have running through Europe. Just 40 years later, after this Bessemer process becomes widespread, you have trains connecting literally all parts of Europe to the point of like France, Germany, and England look completely filled out with rail lines. That allows the transport of people, goods, and information faster and connects cities and Europe itself together. Other elements coming out of the second industrial revolution was chemistry and applied sciences. All right, you have the first invention of vulcanized rubber, which is used in tires and industrial processes, bicycles, and the automobile. Bicycles become a huge deal. You have a small reading, or it's part of a reading you're going to have later this week. Automobiles, which, a massive percentage of the world relies on the automobile. I got to work today because I have an automobile. All of that comes out of this second industrial revolution. Instead of being powered solely by steam and piston, you'll have the advent of electricity, which is used for light, heat, factory motors, consumer goods, washing machines, refrigerators, everything. You have the first true telecommunication systems, with telegraphs being the first one, and eventually the telephone. Your modern smartphone is a show of continuity and change, that people desire greater communication capabilities, and the technology has increased over the years to become the modern smartphone. Fertilizer. People create chemical fertilizers. They don't need manure alone anymore. And this was done actually by, the first of these that was really widespread was done by a German scientist before World War I. He learned that if you can pressurize air, you can create nitrogen as a fertilizer. And they called it literally bread from air because it's cheap. It's so cheap to produce this fertilizer. And everyone can have access to fertilizer, which means food productivity, again, shoots through the roof. Chloroform and antiseptic. Before this, people didn't really have anything to clean wounds except for like hot boiled water or boiled alcohol or alcohol. Chloroform allows people to be knocked out before surgery so they don't feel the saw going through your bones. And antiseptic allowed them to keep the wounds clean. So these are huge advances in society that lowered death rates and allowed for modern surgery as we know it. And then you have refrigeration. And that, of course, is a concept where you're going to remove heat from an area to allow not allow bacteria to set in. You have refrigerated train cars created. And also now you have food that you could never have, like strawberries in the middle of January and stuff, because you just ship them in a train from another part of the world.